I would like to introduce to you the following panel, or better, the following panel's moderator, convener, Annette Krauss, who is an artist and educator living in Utrecht, but working also in other places such as Vienna. In her conceptual-based cross-media and cross-disciplinary, usually collaborative practice, she addresses the intersection of art, politics, and everyday life. She's interested in informal knowledge and in normalization processes that inform bodies and behavior. Annette has co-initiated various long-term collaborative projects such as Hidden Curriculum, Sites for Unlearning, Read-In, ASK, Read the Masks, Tradition is Not Given, School of Temporalities, that aim at disrupting taken for granted truth in theory and practice. And here again, with Tom van der Putte, only the titles of these projects indicate somehow the range of pedagogical, not only pedagogical, but interests in pedagogy as a concept, as a category to be expanded and to be applied to often unexpected situations and contexts. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Annette and her two panelists, Nancy Jouwe and Nana Adusei-Poku.
Also from me, a warm welcome, and welcome back from lunch. I hope you had a great lunch. I have the pleasure to guide you through the second panel, to introduce a little bit the background information, what I was thinking around, how to conceptualize it, and try to navigate later on the discussion. And before I introduce the panel, I would like to actually pick up on something that has been addressed, maybe as trying to start at a certain point that is quite important for me. It's actually the question: why is there such an overwhelming response to education, to such an educational project, which I would like to link actually, when do educational topics get into the center of attraction? And that is very much also linked to research that I'm doing on waves that come and go related to education. And one aspect that is quite important for me, and I think it has been addressed before this morning in the great inspiring panel, that in troubling and alarming times, and however we are living in utterly racist, over a longer time in utterly racist, misogynist, ableist climate, for me it's hard to see education as a solution to a problem, but rather as being part of the problem. And I think, that has been addressed quite some time from different angles, and we are I am searching again and again how to address this moment. Also, it gives you a certain perspective on the panel, also on the politics of education pedagogy, studying learning environments, and also the way how I approached the panel. So I'm very grateful that I have been asked. Thanks to Tom, thanks to Maria, thanks to Hide and Meryl for organizing everything around it, because it gives me the possibility to look again and again into things that I'm trying to work on. Moreover, it gives me the possibility to think through some of these questions together with two speakers that agreed to join us in thinking through some of these moments. Nancy Jouwe and Nana Adusei-Poku. Thanks a lot for coming and joining us in that. So what is the panel about? The central question that I would like to pose for this panel is how to address conditions of coloniality in current educational structures. And how are these conditions of coloniality intertwined with the modern project of education? So what do I mean by that? The conditions of coloniality within modern project of education. So first of all, what is important for me is, of course, the statement that we are still living in, framed by modernity, the legacy of modernity, epistemologically, materially, historically, institutionally. And instead of assuming a separation between colonialism and the European project of modernity, I try to think and find ways, and I hope everyone is helping in that, finding ways to think and do them together. So not to separate them, but to do them together. Thus, I try to not regard slavery, colonialism as something that happened over there in the colonies, but actually directly had and still has impact on the ways we form institutions, we form schools, we do learning, we do the university, our ways of life, how we actually relate to each other. So it's also asking the question, how did we arrive here where we are at the moment, and how can we depart from there to somewhere else? It is something, of course, that I don't come up with, but that post-colonial and decolonial scholarship has developed a rich scholarship around. And here in the Netherlands, we have Gloria Wekke and Kwame Nimako, who are two outstanding scholars around that. If we go beyond the Dutch framework, it's Walter Mignolo, decolonial scholar Walter Mignolo, and post-colonial scholar Gayatri Spivak that are some references for me here. And I know that our two speakers today also have quite a lot to say on these topics. So once more, modernity, I would like to address not solely emerging from a European history. Instead, we need to take into account the modes of control of social life, economic and political organizations that emerge and has been engineered in the colonies. But these technologies have shaped the institutions here and actually still shaping now at the moment, our institutions, our ways of living and learning. And now, of course, the big question is how to do it, how to think and do them together. And I don't really have so much answers to that, because what also these scholars and activists and educators show and trace in various fields, that the separation between what Anne Stoller calls the colony and the separation between the colony and the metropole, or the separation between colonialism and modernity, has been inscribed in all spheres of our life. So they are basically in my body. So how do I relate to that? So let's take the model, so as an example, let's take models of education. Now I'm referring basically to mainstream education, emerging in the 20th century, first and second half of 20th century in Europe. So we have, for example, models of assimilation that educate for the building of national identity, national consciousness. And I'm talking here about, as I said, mainstream education, to concepts of multicultural, liberal, plural education that emphasize cultural diversity, of course, and there's never a clear cut between these. And now I'm only taking 3 models to look at. So if we look at them through various perspectives, and one of them could be the filter how they understand, in their conceptualization, how they understand culture. And all 3 actually have been criticized by post- and decolonial scholars for their essentialist view on culture, with an authentic fixed origin that is unrelated to other cultures. So again, we have this separation, and then the question is, like for me, is how to think actually these relationalities that are always already there. And another example that I would like to give, and I know there are only like really tips at the moment, that I've spent quite some time on, are different concepts of learning that we inherited from this modern colonial enterprise. So models of learning that are kind of, for me, at the basis of what I'm actually doing, which of course relates also back to the Learning Laboratories. And I'm asking myself, okay, what are actually the conceptualizations behind these? When I say I learn. And of course, the good part is that we actually don't really know how learning works. But the bad part is that we think we have pretty good models that kind of suggest what learning is. So how can we kind of navigate between that? And one of them that I've myself taken quite a long time for granted is the concept of learning as an accumulation of knowledge, skills, and patterns of behavior. So accumulation, learning as the acquisition, and then accumulation, possession of knowledge, skills, and patterns of behavior. And I think what happens there is that it can be quite tightly thought together with the concept of progress, and progress as one of the big Enlightenment mischievements. And accumulative understanding and concept of learning very much bolstered up and is still bolstering up concepts of progressive historical development. So this entanglement relates back to concepts of progress that emerged right at the moment when Europe declared itself superior to other people. cultures and use these models actually as legitimation. And this is something that I'm kind of struggling with and want to look into. Moreover, of course, the accumulative understanding of learning, and that goes back to the real estate of education, smoothly fits in and is intertwined with what we call knowledge economy, that is fostering capitalist ideas of accumulation. And I would, in a way, almost propose that we are not living in a knowledge economy, but actually in a learning economy. So my point is that we are still embedded in these concepts and that these concepts produce real consequences when it comes to policy making, organization of institutions, ways of living. And this is where Nana and Nancy come in. Both address what I call conditions of coloniality, and I guess they are framing it differently. Both address these moments in their different practices and research, and I'm very happy that both of you share some insights and research with us. Just a few practicalities. We will do it a little bit different than this morning. We have both presentations up to 25 minutes. Maybe there are some, like 1-2 questions for direct clarifications, if there are. Otherwise, we go through. I will now introduce Nancy, later on Nana, and then we will open up for a discussion. So let me introduce our first speaker, Nancy Jouwe. Nancy works as a lecturer, educator, researcher, engaging in arts and women's rights from a post-colonial perspective. She has been program director of Cosmopolis Utrecht, and she's based in Utrecht, where she's currently undertaking a PhD in the framework of gender, ethnicity, and post-colonial studies. She has co-authored many publications on race and gender issues in the Dutch context, and I would like to name 2, of which the latest is the Amsterdam Slavery Heritage Tour, and I think I saw that you brought the book. And the other one is a little bit older, but has been very important for me when I came to the Netherlands. It's a co-edited publication, Kaleidoscopische Visies, de Zwarte Migranten en Vluchtelingen Vrouwenbeweging in Nederland, the Black Migrant Refugee Women Movement in Netherlands, which is only one example how Nancy manages again and again to link back to a very strong Black feminist movement here in the Netherlands, from which we can learn about forms of organizing, living, and educating. Nana will, and Nancy will specifically talk about her participation in the research project Mapping Slavery, which is a multi-layered project that on one hand maps the Dutch colonial history in the Netherlands and abroad, but also experiments on the other hand with translating this research in encounters with people, walking tours and data sets. So I hand over to you, Nancy. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Great. Thank you so much, Buck, for organizing this event. It's really wonderful. And kudos to you, Annette, for this girl panel. Okay, so my talk is really, you could consider it to be a case study of sorts. Because most of my talk will be about the project Mapping Slavery, but I will try and contextualize it a little bit first and sort of talk about the genealogy also of the project, and then also very much talk about the project itself, and a little bit on what's next if I have time, because I have this luxury of 25 minutes and then, you take on all this time and then it's already running late. So, okay. So, in a way, sometimes this is maybe going to be a history lesson of sorts also maybe. So, who's been schooled in the Dutch education system? Can I see a show of hands? Okay, that's a lot. That's 80% of you. So, who of you has learned more than 2 sentences about the history of slavery? At school? Yeah. That's... Oh my God, that's 10% of those hands. Well, that's exactly why we're doing this. So that's already a great check. Thank you for that. I didn't pay you, so this was real, I hope. So, the Dutch have this interesting notion of looking at their own colonial history as something that happened long ago and is very unrelated to the current affairs in this country. But if you just basically look at how the map looked like when the Dutch were in their sort of colonial, entered the coloniality modernity project. You could see that they're active in at least 4 continents. And so the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia, and actually also Oceania. And so they were pretty much all over the place. It's kind of important to have that sort of mental picture in your mind while proceeding. Okay, so if we talk about the Dutch historiography and historiography, the written interpretation of the past, you could say that when we look at the history of slavery, there was an institute and a monument on slavery being installed in 15 years ago. NINSE, the National Institute for Slavery, and a monument, and I'll show the monuments later on. Both of which were very much because of a lobby from descendant communities itself. There was a sort of educational Dutch history canon introduced in 2009, and with 50 vensters, they call it in Dutch. 50 ways of looking at history, and one of them was also about the history of slavery. There was a TV series in 2011. I'm also mentioning the Black Pete debate because I think it's very much related to this this story. And you could say now that a new generation of both historians and writers are actually writing about this history. And thankfully so, because before that there was actually a large silence connected to this history. So I'm quoting Guno Jones here. With the realization of the National Monument of Dutch Slavery in 2002 and the installation of the National Institute for the Study of Dutch Slavery and its legacy in 2003, its descendants, those who remember, succeeded in making slavery a public issue. This development was preceded by a prolonged period in which the study of the history of Dutch slavery was non-existent in the Dutch memorial and memory landscape. Although for decades a specialized historiography on slavery and slave trade had been developed, this was not considered part of the Dutch historical canon and had little societal impact. Alex van Stipriaan stated that slavery in Dutch education was associated before the year 2000 with the USA and Uncle Tom's Cabin, while around the Dutch history of slavery, a deafening silence could be heard. So there you have it. So this deafening silence up till, well, maybe 2011, when all these events occurred that I was talking about. These are, we actually have 3 monuments at this point in time in the Netherlands. The first one was installed in 2002 in Amsterdam, and it's actually the place where there's an annual commemoration that is shown live on TV also. But another one, which is not well known, the second one was installed in Middelburg. Middelburg was a very important place for the history of slavery in terms of also, you know, the Zeeuwen being very good at the slave trade. They were very sort of early on in the business of the slave trade. And the third one was installed in 2013 in the city of Rotterdam. Again, a monument which was installed by the people from descendant communities. And so this TV series was... Who has seen this TV series, by the way? Oh, I see 2 hands. Wow. Okay, well, it was on national TV. It was there was a lot of PR on it. There was even a junior TV series related to this one. And here you see the 2 sort of main narrators in the story. She's a well-known talk show host. He's a comedian, actually, and the roles were divided as follows. She was sort of the main narrator, and he was sort of telling the story of his family, through which we get a sort of inside look in how it must have been. So that was, of course, one of the immediate responses of criticism. That again, sort of the story was told by from a white perspective, and only sort of the speaker, the black speaker, was considered to be sort of a side note. It's been very interesting in this second decade in the Netherlands. We've also seen this this Black Pete debate coming up, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that. But if not, we can talk about that later. But you could say that it evolved into a second wave anti-racist movement in the Netherlands of sorts, and which consists of, you know, activists, scholars, artists, I think 3 generations of people, but they're definitely pushed by people in their early 20s and early 30s, who very much sort of try to decolonize this whole notion of how colonial history is being written, reproduced in public, but also in the materiality. For instance, the Golden Carriage, which is sort of our way to salute the new economic year. It's where the Queen and the King and the Queen sort of ride in to Parliament, where the sort of parliamentary year then is opened. And on this Golden Carriage, there are all these depictions of enslaved people making their offerings to white Dutch masters, basically. So all these types of things are now being sort of criticized, but luckily enough, we also have some new reflections on Dutch colonial history. Like Annette already said, it's been very much thought out in separate ways. So you have how it's sort of been organized up to very recently in the Netherlands. If we're being schooled in history, you're being schooled in national history, and colonial history is sort of a different analytical layer, and so the metropole and the colony are never thought out in relation, which of course is very problematic if you want to analyze it. But luckily, these are some publications that sort of in diverse ways tackled this notion. And White Innocence was written by Gloria Wekker, who has already been mentioned by Annette, who in her book White Innocence basically wants to problematize the dominant rosy Dutch self-representation, and who basically says, when she starts out her book, she says, well, it's like we collectively, as the Dutch, we did not know about the injustices of the past, nor do we necessarily want to know. And if we did know, it was anyway not our intention. So we can sort of, sit back and relax, because really it's not about us. So this is also why the history of slavery often is being related to Surinamese people or other people of color, but not necessarily a sort of collective we as the Dutch. And she coins the term cultural, she uses the term cultural archive in this book, White Innocence, which was coined by Edward Said in 1993 in his book Culture and Imperialism, where he's talking about 19th century European populations and their cultural archive, which was a storage place where ideas, structures of reference and effect were deposited. And these are ideas based on race. So the content of the cultural archive is what has been transmitted to us over the generation unconsciously, and it gives meaning to our thoughts, feelings, and actions on the basis of race. So this is also a concept that helps us connect the past to the present. So in a way, there's a continuum. The use of the cultural archive also shows us that we still think in those terms. Thank you. So, okay, on to mapping slavery itself. So it's, and I don't have notes, so that's why I'm sort of turning. So mapping slavery is a historical project that focuses on the intersections of the past and the material, and these are some of the questions that we ask. So who were the people benefiting from slavery in the Dutch metropolitan colonies? Where did they live? How did they decide about investments? What traces can we find? And what black presence was there also in the Netherlands and Europe in earlier stages? So some of the concepts that we use, the Cultural Archive I've already explained, and we've already established the fact that very few of you have ever heard of this whole idea of slavery connected to the Dutch Empire. So what we do when we look at the city is also looking at it as an archive. So an archive, the materiality, the spaciousness of the city can also be read, which you could consider to be, hidden remnants, a sort of a palimpsest. So it's been written on, it's erased again, but some of it remains there. And you could consider it to be an absent presence. So I'm going to do now some very basic explaining on what it is, what we do. So what we do is describing locations in the immediate living environment and the former colonies, putting that in a database, converting that to maps, and use that as a base for a variety of educational products, basically. So the walking tours, we have a walking tour in Amsterdam here, Groningen, The Hague, a couple of other cities, Rotterdam, Middelburg actually also. But we're also very much about linking networks. So researchers inside and outside academia, there's a lot of researchers actually outside of academia working on this, who are obviously not often considered to be proper researchers, students, but also memory communities. So in a way also, and this is very important to us, also trying to organize a transnational interdisciplinary community of sorts. So what we've been doing in 2016 is a core team of 5 people here in the Netherlands working on research, but also doing work in USA, Indonesia, and South Africa. And I guess it's also good to sort of point out that 50% of our work is done voluntarily, because it is, again, and this is again the institutional difficulty, the fight you have to do is to actually gain research money because of the way we're doing it, but also the topic that we're, and obviously you have to have this very consistent development of your curriculum as an ambitious research to actually gain that type of money. Otherwise, it's just really too difficult to gain money. Nevertheless, our partners are huge and widespread, which sort of helps us out to work with it. It's interesting that, so from the cultural sector, we do get some money. These are some of our international partners in the US and also in Indonesia. It's all on our website, so you can look it up. So important for me also is to talk a little bit about the genealogy. So who have been our sources of inspiration? 3 things that I want to point out. Definitely the research project from Professor Catherine Hall and her team has been really instrumental for us in how to set it up, but also in a way you could say our Mapping Slavery project is a spin-off from work that was done locally here a couple of years ago with Cosmopolis Utrecht and also the Black Heritage Tour. So I'll explain. So what we've learned from Catherine Hall is, the importance of visualizing information. So we're obviously not about big data, but it is about digital humanities is obviously very important right now. But how to visualize and how to bring across information in a visual manner is quite important. But it also, for us, it is also about bringing it close to home. So making it tangible. It could have been your neighbor, it could have been someone who lived beside you, or you might be living in a house that was formerly owned by a slave owner, which is often the case if you live in the canals of Amsterdam, for instance. And also to show that it was a very widespread system. So it wasn't just the odd, city like Amsterdam or London or Liverpool. No, it was much more widespread than that. And obviously we try to make it based on sound research. Okay, so from our experience with Small Plus Utrecht, we learned that it was important to reach a broader audience. So, we're doing academic research, but it's definitely not meant for an academic public. It's used for a much wider audience with also products that are attractive for a wider audience. So a walking tour, an app, a book, maps. And while doing that, building sort of a community of different stakeholders with it. One thing that we did in Utrecht, which I think is also important from a historiography point of view, is that we connected the history of the Dutch East Indies with the Dutch West Indies. And that's also something that sort of never happens, almost never happens, because usually the Dutch East Indies is connected to the VOC, so the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, which sort of, is still something to be proud of. If we listen to two of our prime ministers who have referred to the VOC as something, 5 minutes, as something to be proud of. But in fact, if we talk about slavery, we're not just talking about transatlantic slave trade, we're also talking about similar numbers in terms of enslavement in the East Indies and Indian Ocean sort of slavery. So, and that's sort of an unknown fact. But also building sort of a walking tour, a heritage tour as a sound business model, and putting the importance of putting central black and brown voices in this story. This is always something that is left out. And where, were they there, yes or no? Well, they were there, and I'll show an example of that. This is just a very simple example of some work that students did together with Dienke Hondis, who's the initiator of this project, where slave ownership was in the city center of Amsterdam. Of course, and this is the thing that immediately hits the newspapers. And I'll skip this. I'll skip this too. Yeah, I'm sorry about it. Oh yeah, no, wait. Yeah, so okay, because I want to focus on Black presence a little bit, both in Amsterdam and So, how do you figure out Black presence? Because it's not in written archives. There might be names in written archives, and then you have to sort of suss out that this was a person of color or not. But actually, here the visual archive helps us a lot. So a painter like Rembrandt, who's worldly renowned, painted at least 24 paintings with Black people on it. And that's been really helpful for us also to see, because apparently he was, neighbors or in the vicinity of a Black community of sorts in his lifetime. So these are the things that you sort of try to suss out in a way that's form of counter-reading or rereading the archive. And also Christian Andriessen, who's a painter drawer in his time, had his parents had 2 young black students in his house, and they probably told him all these stories about how people were being punished in the colony. So he made a couple of drawings on that, and those are the rare finds that make us get a better picture of black presence. Resistance and abolitionism. Anton de Kom, for Dutch people, very famous name. Someone who wrote a book on us. Translated, it means us slaves in Suriname. Wij slaven van Suriname. Very famous book. But someone who was ousted from Suriname and then sadly died at the sort of the end of the Nazi regime. But also, feminists who sort of pitched into. She was also the president of the Anti-Slavery Committee, the Ladies Committee, who did a lot of fundraising on for actually freeing slaves. So you have a Wedgwood cup and saucer that was sold to raise money. So you see here the material archive is also very useful to us. Mariam Markelo doing a libation during. And this is what I really wanted to show because I have 1 minute left, I think. In Utrecht, we've done something similar and came across Eduard van Akaboa, who was an Angolan who was freed and lived here 200 meters further down with his family. He became a smith. This thing is too sensitive. Who became a smith, we see him appear in a register somewhere in 1652, but his descendants lived on in Utrecht, which was cool is that sort of, because we were talking about this on Facebook, some of his descendants came up to us to say, hey, we're family of this Eduard of Akaboa. But it's if we're doing this walk in the city, it's very important also to sort of realize, the black presence in that city already in the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, very much present already. Well, this is an example of what we're working on now. We're actually mapping Dutch New York. New York, well, actually the Dutch, brought slavery to America. A little known fact, again, whether they were among the first to start there and sort of, started New Amsterdam and New Netherlands. We're mapping that now. And actually bringing out a book on it this year. Again, you can actually find these maps on mappingslavery.nl, and also with some descriptions such as that one on the right. So really, it is about. Our work is really I found this morning on Twitter, so I thought you sort of throw it in because it's interesting. One of our members of our network, Ineke Mok, has written a book on the history of an enslaved boy called Kwaku. It's the only book. What's strip book in it in English? Sorry? Yeah, comic or graphic novel. I was looking for graphic novel. Yeah, so this is apparently the only graphic novel in Europe on which covers the history of slavery in some way. So Kwaku, where is it? Yeah, Kwaku is a boy, so people can, children can relate to it. So it's also used in the educational system. It's beautifully done, I have to say, but sadly enough, the Minister of Education in Suriname doesn't like it. So he said it's sort of forbidden to use it in Surinamese education system. So I think it's interesting also how I had to negotiate the institutions the whole time. Yeah, let's leave it at this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nancy. And we will have time enough to go into questions for discussion later on. Nana Adusei-Poku. She is a research professor in visual culture in Rotterdam and guest lecturer in media arts and Master of Fine Arts at the University of Arts in Zurich. Nana holds a PhD from the Humboldt University on the curatorial concept of post-black art. And she has been visiting scholar to many prestigious universities, and amongst others like Columbia University and London School of Economics. And when I was looking into some of the CV that I found, I was quite impressed in how many or to how many educational research groups you are actually connected to in the advisory boards. There's 3 that I name now. It's like the research project Art School Differences in Switzerland, the Queer Theory Institute in Berlin, and your advisory role in the International Network on Education, another roadmap to arts education. Nana has contributed many essays and texts in international journals of art, visual culture, and gender studies. And I'm going to name one of them, and I warmly advise everyone to read it. I'm a big fan of it. It's her essay, Catch Me If You Can, in the online publication Decolonizing Museum. It's a critical reflection on the state of diversity and decolonization in arts and art education. And amongst others, Nana's contribution will revolve around the challenges, pitfalls, and potentials of the term, if not buzzword, diversity. And I'm particularly happy that Nana will situate her talk also within arts education, I believe, and its specificities. Nana, I'm very happy that you're here. The floor is yours.
Yes, hello. Okay, I'm going to multitask a little bit. Thank you so much, Annette, for the invitation, and also thank you, Hidde, for the extensive assistance with everything. Yeah, actually, it's great, Annette, that you mentioned that I'm part of the advisory board for another roadmap in art education, as well as Art School Differences, because I'm very indebted to these programs that were Art School Differences looked at inclusion and exclusion at 3 different art schools in Switzerland. And another roadmap in art education is basically trying to create a counter narrative to the roadmap in art education that was published by the UNESCO, I think, in 2005, which is very much connected to the state of coloniality that Annette also framed in the beginning. So basically, I can only repeat what you said, but my thinking is really indebted to them. Before I go into this talk, which is actually like a rant riff, and there won't really be an end point, or there is not really going to be a conclusion, but I felt very challenged to actually what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie recently said, that it's really time to talk about what we are really talking about. So I'm going to put some very, very uncomfortable questions into the room. I hope that we will be able to talk through. And why are they uncomfortable? Because I'm going to talk also about whiteness in education. And since this is a very white room, and it's not a room full of people of color, I also want to foreclose that it's pretty hard for me at the moment to talk about this research project, because whom am I actually talking to? I'm predominantly trained to talk to white people. I have been trained in the academy to be able to, first of all, make my arguments proper, be as good as an academic as I can be, to encode my language as much as possible, which I'm trying not to do in this talk, as you may notice. And once you do that, then all of a sudden you're too academic. So talking about enlightenment and modernity, etc. There are many pitfalls to this question. But so I'm talking to a white room, but I'm also talking from a black queer femme perspective, working within an institution. And one of the other parts that I want to foreclose, and maybe I put this up, that is part of this project, VDKA Makes a Difference, is the recent letter that came out by Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister. So I'm actually one of the people who should leave from his perspective, because I'm calling ordinary people racist, and that was actually part of his letter. Yeah. So if this is like asocial behavior that I'm displaying right now, but and this is obviously not normal in the perception of the Dutch government, and I am not following the Norman and Waarde in order to find a common ground. I'm actually really for particularism at the moment. The other aspect that I wanted to foreclose is something that Martin Matlin pointed out in his beautiful book On the Corner, is that I understand that there's a difficulty, and maybe we can talk about it later, at the moment, that there is a certain kind of tokenism. Yeah. So when we talk about education, and as Tom as well as the first panel have so beautifully pointed out, is that many of those impulses are actually coming from people who are oppressed within the current system. They're coming from queers of color. They're coming from Black Lives Matter movement, and here understood as really a movement for all Black lives, yeah, which is very often a misperception. So I'm talking also about Black trans people. I'm talking about Black women. Is the sort of you become as a Black scholar the indigenous interpreter. Yeah, so I'm the person of Black authenticity that is talking to you right now, and I just want you to let that sink in, what that actually means, and what that means in the classroom. I will talk about in this talk. Okay, so this was the first part of my rant. The second part, and I'm still not in the talk yet, is something that we haven't really talked about, but that Angela McRobbie so beautifully introduced in her book, Be Creative, where she's talking about our contemporary art school system as highly corporatized, but also as a place of middle classification. Yeah. So when we talk here about learning and education and these educational spaces, and we've learned about alternative spaces, yes, they do exist, but nevertheless, I'm working within an art school which is very middle class white. Yeah. And the point there is also that if we say that liberalism or the left has failed, one of the reasons is that we actually have not talked about what we have to really talk about, and that is white supremacy, and it goes through all of us consistently. Yeah. So when I'm talking about white supremacy, I'm not talking about the alt-right. I am actually talking about a lot of people. I'm talking about all of us. So, first part of the rant. So I can go very, very quickly. Oh, so this is really this. Okay. So Homi Bhabha in an article on Stuart Hall is talking about that minorities mark the beginning of their own enunciation by speaking from anxious places of disavowal, from the hollows of denial or traces of repressed contradictions. And I think this is exactly the place that I am in at the moment, that I am talking from. And I'm using the autobiographical example in this presentation, drawing on Saadia Hartman's work, that it is not a personal story that falls onto itself. It's not about navel gazing. It's really about trying to look at historical and social process and one's own formation as a window into social and historical processes, as an example of them. So, like Hartman, I include the personal in this talk to tell a story capable of engaging and countering the violence of abstraction. Yeah, so this is really important because it's so easy to actually say, oh, this is all pretty subjective. So Vedika A Makes a Difference is a research project that started in 2014, actually. I came to Holland in 2013. Interestingly, like just when this sort of wave started here, the Dutch government realized, oh, actually we have a very diverse population. Let's have some money free. Let's create some research professorships and allow universities apply for that. And so I became the lector for cultural diversity. As you may have noticed, I changed that later on. But so with this task of looking at diversity within the art school, I arrived here. At the same time, something else happened, or actually a little bit before that, is exactly what we talked about earlier, which is why I don't want to go so much into it, but this move to say from minority students to say there is actually a problem here, there is systemic racism, we encounter that on an everyday basis. And I give you examples from around the world, basically, with this hashtag I too am Harvard. That's how it started. But then we have also learned about Roads Must Fall, and I see, of course, a connection here to what has to the Black Lives Matter movement. And the connection is really the fact that the epistemological and therefore also the ontological basis that is taught in our education is completely Eurocentric, and therefore when you are a black student or a student of color, a queer student sitting in these classes, there is epistemological violence consistently reproduced, and this is what these students are actually going against. And the epistemological violence, however, is part of a justification process that makes it okay for black lives to actually not matter. So if you were marching a few days ago in the Women's March and you were not marching in any Black Lives Matter protest, then you were actually participating in the ontological death of black people. Yeah, just to rant further. So I see this as a connection. Here also in South Africa, we have already learned about, I think I was a little bit late this morning, about the liberation of the Markthal, which then led into the University of Color here in Rotterdam, which is a project, an alternative educative space for people of color to actually talk about the issues that are really at stake for black and brown people. I don't want to go so much into that. So there's something happening in Holland, and I think that Nancy has beautifully pointed that out. So what is this pressure that I'm talking about? The pressure that I'm talking about is actually something that Europe has to be understood as a site for post-coloniality, as Annette also stressed. But I want to just use this example here. What you see is an image from a theater company in Rotterdam, which was completely white. It was young like students from around 15 to 18 who were playing Shakespeare, and this was their poster. Yeah, so the black angel, the representation, or the bad angel. the representation of the black woman as like the bad. I don't want to go into that too much right now because there are much more interesting things to think about. But I think this is a beautiful counter narrative here by Yinka Shanibaru. Thank you. So I talk in this text that Annette has recommended about a temporal gap that the historian Michael Hanchard called an institutional temporal disjuncture. It's a text on racial time. It's called Afro-modernity. He's a historian, and he's really invested in the chronopolitical dimension of the racist regime. And what does that actually mean or meant? During colonialism and during enslavement, it meant that resources, whether it was knowledge or it was goods, was always distributed with a temporal delay. Yeah. So first white people, then black people. In terms of education, first white schools have the latest books, then the black schools would get the used books from 4 years ago. So you have a systematic delay in like not bringing everyone onto the same level. What I argue is that our contemporary education system, and here particularly in art schools, when it comes to restructuring curricula, etc., are actually not invested in closing that gap. You can't really close that gap. And what do I mean by that is that queer of color critique, womanist literature, literature on disability, etc., has not been introduced into our core curricula. It is not part of the canon. What does that mean as a black educator who's invested in critical race theory, queer theory, etc., all in connection to visual culture? It's very complex, right? That means to me that I'm constantly encountering students who have actually no idea what I'm talking about. And why don't they have an idea? Because, as Nancy also so beautifully pointed out, most of them don't even know, if they were raised in Europe, don't even know their colonial history. Yeah, so you have to always start over and over again new. And when we think about becoming like a political self-understanding and becoming active as a creative in a field with political ambitions, then you actually kind of lose out in the beginning. Yeah, or does that make sense? So that's one of the arguments about the chronopolitical dimension, and that is actually a colonial tool. Yeah, that we're still experiencing. So the problem is what this, there was one student here, I think it was at NYU, is that white privilege is your history as part of the core curriculum, whereas mine is being taught in an elective, and that is happening over and over and over again. And that's also something that we have at the Willem de Kooning Academy. There's something called cultural diversity, awesome. But you can also just go into the commercial practices and you can do something on sustainability. But that doesn't mean that you're actually going to be introduced to theories of decoloniality, or think about the intersectional structures of exclusion in that field. And of course, the moment I point that out, I'm also questioning the expertise of my colleagues. Yeah, and that is one of the key problems. They don't want to hear that because they're actually really good at what they're doing. And I agree, they are amazing. But you know, actually our current political situation shows us that we have to do better and we have to do more. As a black person, I have to do more all the time. As a white person, you actually don't, but you have to. You have to. If you want political change, there's no excuse anymore. Because Trump, Brexit, etc. What else do we want? So white innocence, to come back to the Dutch context, is definitely one of the most formative texts that you can read at the moment to understand what is actually going on in this country when it comes to the political situation. How much time do I have left? I forgot to time myself. Oh, awesome. Okay, good. So what I want to just point out very briefly is like who I think is really missing in our canon. And that would be somebody like Frantz Fanon. That is someone like Edouard Glissant, Sylvia Wynter, Stuart Hall, Maya Yim, Gayatri Spivak. I can go on and on. It's a Senghor, Hortense Spillers. And most of my students have never heard of any of them. Yeah? And I don't say that you have to know how all of the theorists that you're reading look like, but I love to do that, to be honest. There's a fantastic image of Martin Heidegger sitting on this in the Alps with his pipe or something. It's hilarious, or whatever. Okay, or Foucault in his leather claws. That explains a lot. Okay, so I don't want to. I will just start the next part of this talk. I know that I'm going to run out of time, but I will try my best to make it as cohesive, nevertheless. So when I talk about decolonization, I'm very much in vein with what Annette has pointed out. Arturo Escobar is a very important thinker for me, Ramon Grossvogel, etc., all Latin American thinkers, and who are criticizing basically the Eurocentric, white supremacist basis of our knowledge production. So to decolonize the curriculum, wait a second. To decolonize the curriculum and pedagogical practices means to embrace the impossible. The impossible for me here is not related to bringing non-Western epistemologies and content into established curricula and their related constructed canons. That would be an enterprise that could be established in a fairly short amount of time, I argue. But to convince university directors and teaching staff that these changes are quintessential to make a different future possible seems to be the impossible. The impossible is related to the internal intellectual and emotional transformation processes that are needed within art schools to make decolonization and change possible. By this I mean the intricate, self-motivated work that is necessary to understand one's historically produced position in the world, particularly as a person with white privilege, which becomes even more complicated when that privilege is enhanced through being heterosexual, cisgender, and many other categories and identity positions that fuel into a suppressive normative order. Decolonizing work is uncomfortable work. And it is work that constantly challenges one's comfort zone and can be at times so destabilizing that it increases neglect, rejection, and resistance. This resistance can articulate itself in various forms: insufficient funding, as also Nancy pointed out, rejection of research projects, social policing, or refusal to hire staff that brings expertise in this field that are invested in social change, such as queer studies, post-colonial or decolonial theory, all of which lead into systematic exclusions. And I'm emphasizing this because in this research project has several research projects on diversity led from Art for a Few in the UK, Art School Differences in Switzerland, as well as VDKA Makes a Difference, have repeatedly concluded the desire for diversity and change is present within the art school. But that desire seems not to be fueled by the idea not to having to do the work. And by this, I don't mean programs in intercultural exchange. Oh, yeah, let's go to Burkina Faso, no. That have the tendency to exotize the other and reproduce the status quo. The work means to start the reflection where it hurts the most. To look at our entangled histories without losing track of the consistent intersectional power dynamics that reproduce themselves on a global scale. So, I had one time this idea that everyone has to just learn everything, but that is an idea that is, of course, a utopic and equally impossible wish, speaking against the hierarchies and often erasure of knowledges and practices that don't confine with the dominant narrative of modernity. A modernity that claims to be universal, but as Sarah Ahmed points out, the universal is a structure not an event. It is how those who are assembled. It is how an assembly becomes a universe. And talking about assembly and coming together, when you think about it, the Enlightenment thinkers, you know, like the Frankfurt School, this is actually not for me, but the Frankfurt School, they would come together and, you know, like, or they would actually say that Enlightenment came into being in Europe's coffee houses, yeah, over a tea or a coffee, drinking hot chocolate. But where was the coffee, the tea, the hot chocolate, and all of that coming from? Yeah, so this is, I think it's a beautiful picture to think about how knowledge came into being and how it is embodied and how you participate in it even when you don't think you are. Now I completely lost my thread. So the foundations of this modernity that we live in and that has formed from the beginning deprived black and brown people of our ontology created the legitimation of the unworthiness of our bodies and spirit and our labor. This modernity is what we teach in various iterations from kindergarten to university. And the philosopher Sylvia Wynter, one of the most important post-colonial thinkers of our time, she's still alive, she's in her 90s, and author of an essay called No Humans Involved, has called us, and here I mean teachers and educators, out on reproducing the foundation of that modernity through an idea of human and humanity that places the category human outside of culture and subjectivity, but allowed to claim numbers and statistics as a classificatory and ordering belief system. And this means by reproducing an idea of objective knowledge production, we reproduce the foundations of our disciplines and the hegemonic modes of economic rationality. Yes, there are now additional courses, as I mentioned, in Rotterdam called Cultural Diversity or electives, which address post-colonial theory. In other parts of the world, there are entire departments dedicated to Black studies, post-colonial studies, or queer theory. But further, Wynter shares that exceptionalism, with which any subject is treated that involves the other, fuels into a whitewashing of our institutions and curricula. And you can actually see that argument in a different way, for instance, in Gayatri Spivak's, what is her book called? The Aesthetic Education in the Era of Globalization, where she's equally saying that, you know, our disciplines or the disciplines of the humanities are not strong enough anymore in order to create that momentum that would actually bring social change. So I think it's also the question, like, how do we navigate that space, yeah? So approaches that don't confine with this modernity, which I argue have to be considered a practice rather than a static concept. They are based on an understanding of learning as a holistic project. So we have heard about bell hooks earlier today already, but it's very much in the vein of that, which is a threat to the establishment and questions your colleagues' mastery and knowledge base, as well as the institution's credibility, importance, and tradition. So in my classes, I'm often confronted with the question, why haven't I heard about Judith Butler and the heterosexual matrix earlier? Why did I never hear about Frantz Fanon, Sylvia Wynter, Edouard Glissant? My course is often an elective, of course, yeah? And I'm particularly pointing this out because we had cases, and this project, VDKA Makes a Difference, is embedded research, yeah? So which means basically my teaching, the programming, my experiences are quintessential for an understanding of what is actually the state of decoloniality, if it even exists in the school. And I'm pointing this point out about, for instance, Butler and gender theory, because there are students who are gender non-conform and who are struggling with teachers who are in complete denial about their existence and the right of different pronouns in the school and their right of having different toilets. You know, these are all things, when I'm talking about epistemic violence, it's really violence that is experienced on an everyday basis. So how are you supposed to become the creative that you could be to survive in this neoliberal economy if you are on a daily struggle whether or not somebody is going to use the right pronoun in your classroom? Yeah. And I think that's important to point out. the narratives that I hear from students are very much the same that I would tell my teachers when I was studying in Berlin. Yeah, so you are too subjective, you are this or this and that, but it's actually some time ago and nothing has changed. I have previously argued that critical educators have to deal with a different form of racial time, meaning that there is a chronopolitical dimension to our teaching. There's never enough time to catch up in 1 week with theories and practices which will neither the teachers nor the students allow to go beyond the content presented and further and deepen the subject. There's no thriving, only scratching on the surface. And I'm going to jump a little bit because I want to talk about being being a black female educator, because, and I have actually I use this part because this is the reality. This is what we are not talking about. This is what I would not necessarily talk about. Yeah, if I would not think that this is actually a political time in which I cannot be a negotiator. I don't want to be a negotiator. And I'm using this imagery because black women have historically been the care workers, have historically been the ones who are doing the emotional labor. And working around whiteness and talking with white people about whiteness is not nice. It is not nurturing. It is really hard labor, and it is emotional labor, and it's emotional labor that you do then on a daily basis with your students. It is beautiful once it has cracked open, but it's also extremely skilled labor, and that labor is coming from learning that through your very existence. Yeah, so the post-colonial theorist Sueli Rolnik is talking about knowing bodies. So you have that knowing body and you use that in your classroom. And if you are in an educator, then you have to ask yourself, as a white person, am I able to have that conversation with my students? Am I actually having that conversation with my students? Or is it the elephant in the room and it is much easier to read some post-colonial theorist and talk again about the other? Because this is what's happening usually. You want to talk about whiteness, but what you're actually talking about is the other. What you're then going to explore is the experience of the other, the suffering, the endurance, etc., etc. Look at the Black Panthers, and and then you start defining your radicalism. I think this is what we have to start talking about in art education and in actually any education. But that is not what has happened. It's so much easier to look somewhere else. So there has been in recent. I'm going to wrap it up because I think I'm okay. There has been in recent years, and I could actually give you more insights in what we've done at the school, and maybe I do that at the very end. But there has been in the past 1 to 2 years a kind of not an outcry, but when you read Sarah Ahmed's work, when you read Tamura Lomax, for instance, these are all female educators of color who are talking about resignation from institutions. The institution is not a nurturing space because you either become an adjunct, you are interchangeable, you're angry, you're getting all these different labels, but you're actually doing the revolutionary work that is important. Or as Wael has pointed out, you're the terrorist inside, yeah? You're too ideological, etc. And it is not that in those institutions that you have a lot of white allies. No, you don't. Why don't you have white allies? Because you're actually challenging your colleagues' expertise. So this is the problem that we're facing as people of color, or that I am facing within an institution. So, but what did we do? There are a few allies who, for instance, joined our reading groups on inclusive pedagogy, who were very, very eager to engage. I have to briefly show my team to just give you a. This is the team. That's me on the right side, and that's my colleague Tiana Boston Mama. So we're two people, two women of color, who try to do that work inside of the institution, which actually gives you already an insight in like how impactful we can be, right? But because we are the embodied bad conscience of our colleagues as well, it is, negotiable. But so what we did, we did workshops using the theater of the oppressed with colleagues who had time and who were interested. Time is an important aspect when you want to do that work, because many of the teachers don't have enough time. That's a structural problem. Talking about systemic racism, they don't want to make time. They don't get enough funding in order to actually change the structures. Yeah, so I'm not just ranting against my white colleagues. I also see the problem is much deeper and much more complex than I have displayed it for now. But Theatre of the Oppressed was really important. We have the brown bag lunches in which we, as I said, discuss. You see how big the group is. It's actually all really like super small scale. And I maybe want to just end on this note, because, and maybe that's also something that we then can talk about, that decolonization does not mean empowerment for Black and people of color. And I think that is extremely important to take into consideration. And what are we going to do with this is another question. Amiri Baraka and W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as, what's his name, Hendrik Clark, Mummy and Clark, Kenneth Clark, civil rights activist, sociologist, etc. Amiri Baraka, one of the founding members of the Black Arts Movement. They were all, W.E.B. Du Bois, important Black thinker, they were all reached a point where they didn't want to be the Black token, where they said, you know what? There is no reason to talk to white people. It won't change anything. And this is where we're at. And I think that's uncomfortable, but I think that's what we have to talk about. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nana and Nancy, for your insights, your talk, your provocations, and your questions. And of course, we are opening up in a second.
I think the room is catching their breath. Maybe.
Where to start from here?
Are we all on? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, there's one question that I would like to pick up immediately, actually. Maybe also to give you a few seconds of pause to kind of like bring us somehow into the game again, back in. And that's very much the question, okay, what is at stake right now in the very teaching encounters at the academy or at different other learning environments where we are. And I guess there also, like, the three of us already have very different places where we are actually teaching. And I think it was very interesting how you brought in, of course, the students, but also the moment of how do you engage with your colleagues. And how do you bring that to a moment that it's considered to be a moment of importance, actually, to talk about these things, because what we also know is, like, or at least from my own perspective, working at the HKU here in Utrecht, these small little employments that we have. I mean, I bring immediately in the economic questions also, how that is a division within, that brings in divisions, so that I'm working there now for 4 or 5 years, and after 2 years, I would say I had a kind of glimpse of who is actually working with me, only in the finance department, because we are going in and going out on these small little employments, and struggling with a colleague since 2 years about bringing in a moment where we could actually share ideas about, and it's hilarious that we think about, it's about education, that we share about how we are actually doing our education, our teaching, our learning with a group of students that do see us all. So this is something that I was immediately thinking about. And the second part, before I would like to pose the question to you, Nancy, like what is your immediate teaching environment at the moment, is another thing that struck me quite a lot. I'm teaching in the third year, where I have the third year bachelor student at the Fine Arts Academy. And I'm saying that, I'm also teaching the other ones, but there I have a whole group of 50 students. I would say 70% white, Dutch students. I'm not very young, very, very young. And after Trump got elected, actually what occurred to me is that they are so young that actually now in March, when there will be the election here in the Netherlands, it will be the first time that they have the possibility to vote. So we started to talk about, so what is this? I mean, first of all, it occurred that some of them did not even know that there are elections, but only, thanks God, only a few of them. But then I think that is one discussion. The other discussion that followed up on that is actually discussions with colleagues of mine, which I think is quite interesting or not so surprising in the Art Academy. Exactly. So is that our role, really? What I would call now civic education or exchange in the classroom to talk about the elections? And I was saying, like, but is it our role? How can you be separate anyway? Yeah. So, but like for me, it's more about this experience of that there is this discussion, obviously, to also like maybe tear out a little bit about the specificities of maybe arts education in the Netherlands. I don't know how broad we can take it. So, but maybe also to get a little bit of glimpse of what is your direct teaching environment in the various fields.
Oh, well, I actually, yeah, I just stopped teaching the day before yesterday so I'm still recovering. No, at the Amsterdam University College, which is an extremely elitist environment. And which is a mixed group of Dutch, sort of Dutch indigenous and international students. And before that, I also teach, for instance, at the University of Applied Science in Amsterdam. And so the latter group is already like, that's 75% people of color, as opposed to, a completely white audience, save for two Asian women, young women. So already I'm hyper aware of entering those types of spaces and what I represent. But sort of to come to your point of politics, I squatted for 3 or 4 years before I entered the university, and I sort of felt that the squatting scene is a community of learning as well. So I was very struck by the level of apoliticalness when I entered the university here. So I always have to drop in politics, whatever I teach, I think. So the whole notion of not talking about things coming, like elections coming up, that would be ridiculous to me. And so, people are political subjects as they are sitting in the room. So I think that's sort of a given. But to talk about race issues, I think, is another sort of political choice. I mean, it's already been pointed out by you very eloquently, but I think I think these issues of who's in the room and why, and what does that entail for us being part of a educational community right now, I think that should also always be part of a discussion somehow. I don't know what you think of
Yeah.
that. Well, it's clear what you think of that.
My students don't get away with not talking politics in the classroom. No, but I mean, I must say that there is a certain hungriness amongst the students once you start talking about race, once you talk about gender, ability, their position in the world, particularly as art students, and they're always very, very grateful. That's what I experienced. But I, for instance, teach at the moment a thematic seminar at the Piet Zwart, and there is a lot of confusion. There's also a lot of fear at the moment. So I think it's important to address also that fear of the times to come, and how we together can create a possible future. So I think it's extremely necessary to address these issues. And I must say, after being for almost 4 years at the Willem de Kooning Academy, for instance, and having had the opportunity to teach in the general studies courses and just introducing these themes like visual representation of stereotyping, etc., that has opened many of the students up immensely. So that had a lot of impact. And so now there's this and there's like the third and the fourth year now are the ones who, for instance, challenged the Hogeschool they wanted to have the rainbow flag for coming out day on the school, on top of the school, as like so that all the Hogeschool buildings have a rainbow flag on coming out day. And the school said no. We have to stay neutral. So that, of course,
said no.
Yes.
Wow.
They said no. You can read it in the local newspapers. I'm not spilling the tea here. So they said no, and they also, and I didn't get into that, published this little pamphlet at the beginning of the last school year, which is consistently quoting Pim Fortuyn, who, if you don't know the Dutch discourse, has been in the late 1990s, early 2000s, like a pre-populist anti-Islam and xenophobic, whatever. Like I can go down the list. But they quoted him for their I always have problems with this word. Meriocratie. Thank you. Meriocratie. Meriocratie and sort of pluralistic school model. So this is what their students are up against, and I am absolutely for politicizing them in the classroom.
But I think a common problem that a lot of teachers and also students, at least that I notice also, that we don't necessarily own a common language still to talk about these race issues, for instance. So, I have students coming up to me saying, can I actually say black? Is that not offensive? Is that not racist? So, they're very afraid of also saying the wrong thing. And at the same time being extremely eager to go further. Mm-hmm. So, there's a lot of work to be done also. And language, I think, mm-hmm. the idiom that we need to further develop is I think, sometimes lacking in our collective minds, that we actually have to work on the idiom also, which is part of the hard work you were referring to in your talk.
Are there any questions?
Hello, I'm Gili. Relating to the comment you just made, which was the question I was really trying to form in my mind. There are so many traps, so many holes when you try to formulate the language of a question. And I think it's more specifically the lack of an inclusive language that we are missing for our common discourse. And the amazing presence of the divisive language, like statements, your history, my history, your history is in the curriculum, my history is elective, where it's our history. It's a told history in the curriculum and an untold history in the elective.
I don't know. I think that the common language. Oh, sorry, I just jumped in.
No, yeah, go. Go for it.
But I think when you read post-colonial theory, when you read womanist literature, it is actually pretty inclusive. I think one of the interesting aspects about that critique, for instance, for me is that the language that I would use or that comes from the Black radical tradition is extremely particularizing, right? It's creating a bigger gap when you talk about the post-colonial issues, etc. But the sheer fact that Black and brown people have over centuries produced knowledge that is extremely, extremely insightful and is visionary and could actually really already have initiated a different future is to me where I have to categorically say, no, it is absolutely okay to point out differences because the differences are there. And they're not going to go away, tomorrow. And I love to refer to Edouard Glissant's thinking and writing about relationality and the non-total of our existence, the fluidity of our very being, and the notion of opacity. Like, I don't understand what you're saying, but that's okay. You know, I can still be your friend. I can still be in relation to each other, and you are also going to form me. So for me to have like a common knowledge, no way. Absolutely no way. Why? Like, since when is whiteness creating a common knowledge for me? I have been excluded from that consistently. Consistently.
Yes, of course, but it's like, but it starts, we begin first and foremost by...
Can you use the mic because we can't hear you? We can't hear you.
We begin any kind of change and any kind of progress first and foremost by talking to each other and learning each other's stories.
I don't know. That was exactly my point. I don't know.
That we shouldn't converse or...
You know, I think that was actually my ending point where I was basically pointing out, you know, when I have a mixed student body, like when I have a mixed class, and I want to talk about... let's say, one of my research interests, because this is like, yes, this is also my research, but one of my research interests that I'm like, excited about is at the moment Vanessa Beecroft and Kanye West. So I want to talk about Vanessa Beecroft and Kanye West's installation for the Yeezy 3 fashion launch, which is highly controversial. And I want to enter that conversation, and I have so many thoughts like about the intersections of visual culture, popular culture, etc. And one of my white students says, why do they actually portray themselves as thugs and criminals with low education? Okay, full stop. We have to talk about whiteness first. So I have to bring it back. I have, however, a couple of Black students in the room who actually would have been easily been able, and that is at the University of Arts in Zurich, where I'm also teaching, who were also rebellious, as Tom pointed out earlier today. I'm in that department. So the Black students, I cannot cater to them what they actually need in that moment. So what I'm constantly doing is I cater to the white students, and I think, you know, I'm not necessarily for separatism, but I think there are moments also in education that are really important to have safer spaces. It's a radical position.
Can we maybe have 2 questions together or 3? Because we're running already out of time.
She had her hand up along over there.
So
just right there.
Okay, and then you. And then there was someone in the middle, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, there are also the students who, Black students, Asian students, African, German students, that also speak up. This is what is happening, like in the seminar context. And also what I would like to say, the way, I mean, Nana, really, I think what you point out is extremely important, and it's we have to remind the political, structural, economic kind of conditions we are operating in, and then, of course, we all, like, after hearing you, where am I in this rant, in an academic kind of framework, and this addresses the question of subjectivation. I mean, as a kind of, to speak as a political subject in that kind of context. And we have been in conversation about the work of Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, and exactly the book you have been referring to in relation to this question of affirmative sabotage. And this is, I mean, this idea of what is critique, how to articulate critique in this kind of to your colleagues. But I really would like to remind, we are not alone. We are with students. I mean, we ourselves are students in that kind of framework to learn, to politicize ourselves. So I think this is an educational project for all of us in educational frameworks. And I'm a bit nervous, I'm not shaking, not nervous, I don't know why. But because you have really a lot of points were very important. But I mean, this affirmative sabotage, double consciousness, Du Bois that you have been mentioning, how do you relate to this? I mean, because Frankfurt School is just a fucking failure in terms of critique. So double consciousness, kind of, we have to try to find our vocabularies to sheet the system, maybe also speak in a different language to a colleague who just is really ignorant and racist. It happens, like, yeah, so. But then, do I get depressed or not? And this is like, do we need to learn many languages at once? Maybe, can you say something about that?
Can we first have the other question?
Yeah.
Yeah,
She has it already.
mic.
I have one. I have
She
one.
has it.
She does. Maybe this also follows on, Doreen, from some of the points you were making. I was struck here, but also in the previous panel, by the focus on higher education. And it occurs to me, I mean, and I speak both as a mother of teenagers and as an academic, that and teenagers that go to a state school in a metropolis where the colony is firmly embedded, yeah? So in London. It seems to me that there is also a very important project that we need to take on, which, Annette, I think your work often does, which is looking at how these kinds of questions pertain first and foremost to what in the UK we call primary and secondary education, which obviously is called slightly different things in different places. So actually in these situations where a curriculum is very different, where the concept of elective doesn't take place, where in certain state formations questions of multiracial education are embedded, for instance, in the UK education system. Of course, this depends on where you are. And of course, the quality and intergenerational knowledge transfer within those contexts is very different and circumstantial, relational, as you say. But what I would be really interested to find out what your... I mean, I know, Annette, you've worked in these locations many times. I will be interested to find out what you think needs to shift or can be expanded within these educational contexts, which is where the imagination, the emancipation, and the politics of the people that then become our colleague students when they get to us in higher education, have their political imaginations initiated. Because it would seem to me that there's a critical political moment or set of years there that, in a way, by the time we get to higher education, we might have fucked up already.
Which actually says secondary education of primary education. So it's
I
always...
I think both. I mean, you know, kindergarten. I mean, you know.
True. There was a third question, or are we going on that?
Just following up on the previous two, actually. Yeah, the main question I think I would have is, as a white person operating on this intersectional axis, how can we navigate respectfully to help share the burden of addressing these issues as better allies, to not speak for but help share the work in a better way in the institutions we're working in. I was just wondering if you had some thoughts on that. So maybe making new umbrella language, but to think about what kind of allies and partnerships we can form.
Who wants to go first?
I take so I'm gonna.
No, it's okay. Well, no, I maybe for the primary and secondary education part. Before we started mapping slavery, so Traces of Slavery Utrecht was actually something we did with primary, secondary schools. So we worked with 7 schools here in Utrecht, in sort of poorer parts also of Utrecht, and we actually worked with a visual artist, as I thought that was sort of the best way to steer their imagination, represent also sort of a black body, which is also a successful visual artist, but also doing very communal artwork. So they were actually making art, thinking about it, and connecting it to that history. And even more so, I noticed that it's very hard for primary school teachers or secondary school teachers to, especially in these areas where economically deprived areas of the city, they don't have the time at all to go into this type of stuff. So even if people write up sort of sheets for teachers to work with a certain topic, they're all thrown in the bin basically, because they don't have the time, they don't have the energy for it. It's a real problem. So you have to be really creative, I think. And I think visual artists actually really work well in that respect. And also the other thing is to have someone there that wants to do the work with you in the school system. It's about the people. So you have to, in one case, I actually wrote to the director, who immediately responded. So I was sort of blown away by the fact that he was so positive. So you really have to suss out the proper sort of human channels in a way also. That's how it kind of works. Because these people are overloaded. It's even more difficult to change that system in a way. But that's also, I think, why a lot of extracurricular, outside of academia type of activities are taking place, where young kids, but also there's a lot of summer schools now that are there because the regular curricula don't offer that. So there's a couple of summer schools on decoloniality now because, there's not a proper post-colonial curriculum also in university at the moment. So there's a great gender studies program here, for instance, but that's the type of thing that's missing out. So I think people also. The alternative circuit in that sense is also bringing something where the system is lacking.
Yeah, I think it's Andrea. It's hard that question because when you look at the numbers in Holland for the way how students are filtered out, students of color in particular. Then you have to go to kindergarten, and then you go to primary, and then next filter. So that's a big issue and a big problem. But many of the research projects, such as Another Roadmap, such as Art School Differences, they had propositions. Another Roadmap is still going on, but Art School Differences has finished. They had propositions to actually make that bridge and make these connections, but then it ends up with the claim by the funding bodies, which were actually the art schools themselves who commissioned that they had that they manipulated the results, and that they are ideological, and that they already had a predisposed ideological bias when they started the research. So that's it's. No, we're not talking about Rotterdam, we're talking about Switzerland. They had enough money to fund that.
Obviously. I think to link it back to Tom's research project, because I'm reminded that Stuart Hall often said, to name the king, that teaching in a secondary school in Birmingham was one of the things that instigated his thinking about setting up the Centre for Cultural Studies. So I think this, and this is at the moment, the initial moment that we were introduced to at the beginning, Tom, with your research outline. And I just think there's something that's very critical around research into secondary education in the 70s or in the long 60s, there's some critical political activity that went on there within the secondary school system. That as higher education activists, academics, we can really learn from still and think about applying.
Yeah,
so really rich territory there.
It is. But I mean, because I forgot to address Doreen's question, basically. I think you kind of gave the answer at the very end, which is really beautiful. It's like learning. You said, do we have to learn many languages at once? And I think that's actually the case. That's when you know, I hate the term inclusive pedagogy by now. I really don't want to talk about inclusive pedagogy. To reject it, I think, is quite nice. But nevertheless, the sort of emotional capacity that you have to embrace the, also to withstand the tension sometimes, and to name it, and to say, to tell your students, that's what I do. I make it very, very clear. This is not nice, I think, for none of us right now. Let's take a break. Let's breathe. Let's do some autogenic training. Let's do something, but let's work through this together, because this is an emotional journey. But that's a competence that you can only learn, as you said, like together with your students, however. But then I think it's also important to take out the sort of authority that we have as educators very often. Because I remember sitting in seminars on Frantz Fanon with a completely white class. Yeah, so there was a teacher who thought that text was important, the fact of blackness, which was great in the first place. But then at the very end, I got the credits for it. I was so glad. I thought I had to, take drugs in order to be able to survive that, because they were using the N-word and so forth. And then at the very end, he came to me, and I was like in the beginning of my 20s, and he said, I can learn so much from you. And that happens also so often when you are a student of color, when you're a queer student of color, is that your teachers all of a sudden turn to you and you're like, you educate me, but what does that mean in terms of the relationship? It's just, it's very, very difficult. And in terms of, to give you an example from South Africa, so the researcher, it's the Institute for Diversity and Education, and run by Melissa Stein, who has published this book or this study called Being Different Together. So all invested in this like sort of post-apartheid, we all have to have more inclusive classes in secondary education as well. They so the same place, right, or the same space that is now claiming, or where students are on the rise saying we want a decolonial institution. In the same moment, Melissa's plan to institutionalize the diversity program that she created, which is called Critical Diversity Literacy, has been launched in secondary education by the government. So what you see here is that this person, this white person who's like invested her entire life in really like undoing what apartheid has created in that country, is instrumentalized in order then for the government to justify, yeah, but we are doing something, right? And at the same time, it does not change the colonial structures of that education system. So I'm very wary, and I'm very aware of the, like the propositions like having white allies or not. I cannot give you answers at the moment, but there is always the pitfall of this antagonism, this aporia that we're stuck in, affirmative sabotage. To finish off on that, there's this a beautiful text by Nikita Davan where she's also bringing in affirmative sabotage. And what I like in that text is basically, yes, I am constantly criticizing modernity and but nevertheless, my sense of freedom, my sense of like being able to sit here very, very Ariendish in terms of like doing politics by speaking out, is still embedded in that thinking, right? And I'm interested in spaces that allow us to imagine embodied something that is a freedom that we may not even be able to imagine yet.
Thanks a lot, and I believe that we are cutting here in order to maybe directly continuing the discussion in the break, because we are not at the end of the conference, because there's still a lot to come. I would like to thank you very, very much, also the audience, for the questions.